All right, everybody, welcome to the Turtle Island House of Being seminar, part 2, Being in Time, where we are in Division 1 and Chapter 4 in the first half of Chapter 5. Welcome, it's good to have everybody. We have a record low turnout this week because a few people who have been here every week have been their jobs are not letting them come today. So that includes Isaiah and Frank. So welcome. It's great to have all of you. And it's really just me and Brian here right now. Sammy's over there eating. We'll be and we'll be over in a minute. But for now, let's just turn it over to the people. Does anybody have any immediate thoughts, reflections on these on Chapter 4 and Part 5?
If we want to start at the beginning, I have a question from the second page of the
Second
reading.
page.
Yeah, and it's not like the most intense question, but it's something that struck me right away when I read it. So on at the top, so let's start at the bottom of 149. The final sentence says, in this kind of being is grounded the mode of everyday being oneself. The explication of this mode will enable us to see what we may call the subject of everydayness, the they. So what I was really curious about is why Heidegger retains the word subject. Because it seems like everything he's been doing has been moving away from subject-object ontology. So it was just weird to me that he would come out and say that we're trying to seek what the subject of everydayness is, even if the subject is different here than it is when we typically think of subject.
It's a really good question.
Ontology. It was really weird that he used it here. Everybody else had.
You're kind of cutting out, and your mute was flicking on and off.
Our mute's on.
Hold on. I'm gonna reload this. Okay, we cut out as well. Okay. So Jacob, you were cutting out. We were cutting out. Is everything okay now? Cool. And Andy,
I turned down my bandwidth. Hopefully that helps.
your sacrifice is appreciated. Did anybody have any thoughts to Jacob's question?
He put subject in quotes.
Yeah, it is in quotes. Is he just being snarky? For me, I thought kind of like, is the subject of everydayness the they?
Well, no, because okay. Section 25. Ignore Spanish my teeth. In Section 25, he's talking about the question of the who answers itself in terms of the I itself, the subject, the self. And then he starts out by talking about subjects and like our idea of the subject. So I think it makes sense to lead off and he says what we may call the subject of everydayness. It's a little different than saying the subject of everydayness. I don't think it's snark so much as pointing out just the word subject.
That he's still confined by the language anyway. The subject's just going to be the most fitting.
Right. And he may also just be like, okay, we may call this a subject, but what does that mean?
Man, our video keeps shutting down. Oh, well. So, Yeah, so he puts it in quotes, and when I was reading that, I didn't mean if he meant like almost if he was using it playfully as like to say also like the topic of everydayness or like the theme of everyday, or like, you know, not just as the typical way of thinking subject object, but also as thinking like this is the kind of the what everydayness is about is the they. So there might have been some kind of a pun there, but I mean, obviously with the translation, it's impossible for me to tell. So,
are you guys, just really quick, are y'all talking about page 150?
Yeah, at the top.
Okay, hold on one sec.
So I'll just fill a silence for a minute with my voice to say that.
Well, actually, I just had to look at that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Wait. Oh man, I thought you were gonna say something about it.
No, I totally am. But if you have like an announcement or something that you wanted to make before we get started, like that's totally cool. I didn't mean to cut you off at all.
Yeah, I guess I'll say it. It's just to say that I read the Lee Braver's Heidegger Thinking of Being, which is supposed to be a supplementary text to this, and he says the part about this chapter. He kind of restates that this book is all held together by interdependent definitions, and it's one of those things you have to read through before you can understand what he's doing at any part, because it's like a spiral. And but with all of that being said, chapters 5 and 6 are where it really kicks into gear, and there is some meandering, and there's some stuff that's not too. I mean, it's kind of like there's some stuff where he's just thinking aloud apparently, but there's some real bare essentials that lay the groundwork for the rest of the book and also for the rest of his career. So yeah, that's all I was going to say. So here at the beginning of chapter 4, which is where we're at on 150, this is like he's just about to induct us into all of that, and part of that is like, so section 25 is, it can be a little confusing because for like the first 2 pages, he's saying all this stuff about subjects and selves and I's, and he says some things about consciousness, and he's saying some stuff that just doesn't sound quite like him. But I mean, if you follow it closely, he's responding to Husserl, and also, you know, Descartes, the Descartes that remains in Husserl, and he's also, I mean, preempting Sartre in certain respects. So. But I mean, really, he spends those first couple of pages just being like, well, we know this, we know that about subjectivity or about consciousness, but those things are wrong because of or maybe we need to go deeper because of these reasons. And then that's where he'll drop it into gear in the next section. That's all I had to say.
Okay. What did Andy have to say? I didn't have anything to say, sorry.
I just wanted to put the camera off for myself.
I was going to say something pretty much along the same lines of what Dave was talking about. Like, I read it as him kind of laying out Descartes' conception of subjectivity so that he can answer it later in the chapter. But I also thought it was interesting that he kind of later in that paragraph uses the word subjectum.
See, I understand his use of subject in section 25. I'm talking specifically about the subject in the introduction to the chapter, which is used differently than the subject when he's talking about Descartes' subject.
Yeah, I just don't know.
And I don't think it's that important. I just thought it was interesting.
So what does he do in section 25? There's at least one part, I already kind of said, you know, that he does this thing where he's trying to separate what he's doing from the more Cartesian way of thinking about the subject or the I. And he throws the formal phenomenology of consciousness under the bus on the second paragraph of 151. But then below that is like where there's kind of like this quintessential Heideggerian moment where he says, this is the mid third paragraph on 151. He says, perhaps when Dasein addresses itself in the way which is closest to itself, it always says, I am this entity, and in the long run says this loudest when it is not this entity.
Oh, that cleared something up for me. I missed him saying perhaps. So I just like read it as like him stating that and then going off of that. And I was like, what is your substantiation here? But he's just saying perhaps. Cool.
Right, and it's a preliminary to what he'll be saying once we get to the part where we see that the Dasein is always essentially being with, it's inextricably being with others, with other Dasein in a world of involvements, and that world of involvements and others constitutes it constitutes significance for the being in the world of any particular Dasein, which is really what he gets into that in the last bit of this chapter. But I don't know, like if I was to I would think that it would be good to really dig in on a couple of the paragraphs that happen right towards the end here. But before doing that, I just wanted to see if, does anyone have any more questions about?
I have a list.
You have a list of questions. That's perfect. Yeah, anybody with questions, just throw them in there.
If any of them are important, I'll let you know. Started with 149, right?
Okay. Yes.
Okay, you can give me a minute. Okay, let's see. I think it kind of got a little bit cleared up as it went on, but on page 155, he says that it's the first full paragraph, Heidegger original, page 119. Let's see. No. Dasein becomes something that it can itself proximally come across only when it looks away from experiences and the center of its actions, or does not as yet see them at all. I don't know. It seemed to me that he was saying that Dasein finds itself in ready to hand, and it encounters others when it looks away from experiences, and I just like couldn't quite figure out what he meant there, but I might have also misread it.
So I don't know what he meant, but it did remind me of, like, this is probably stupid, but it kind of reminded me, this part specifically kind of reminded me of like what they say in psychoanalysis about like desire and how desire functions. Like there's kind of this idea that you can never really know your desire if you confront it head on. And anytime someone tells you up front what their desire is, what they're really doing is kind of concealing something else, a more hidden desire that might not be something that they themselves recognize or are conscious of. I don't know. Like I said, that could be really stupid, but that whole idea of like you can't really approach truth head on. You have to kind of approach it from an angle. That's kind of what I thought. I don't know what y'all sort of were thinking of when you read that.
He's trying to, it seems like he's trying to argue against the assumption that, or the ontological interpretation that one's own subject is present at hand, and then the rest of the subjects are also present at hand as occurrence. And so, but I didn't know if, I guess I assumed by framing it as like they're not, I don't actually, just Dave has something to say, never mind.
I kind of, oh, sorry.
No, say it, Andy.
I thought of, you know, like this is kind of what poetry does, right? Like poetry doesn't make an argument head on, right? Poetry kind of comes at things from an angle to reveal them. And then I was sort of also thinking about what y'all were saying about how some of Heidegger's later work, I think there was a conversation a couple of weeks back, or maybe I read somewhere, that some of Heidegger's later work deals with poetry. Yeah, exactly what Lydia is saying in the chat. Tell the truth, but tell it slant, right? Like that kind of concept is like, if you try to look straight at the truth, it sort of disappears. You have to look at it at the corner of out of the corner of your eye, right? Which is like what poetry is really good at, or certain other forms of writing. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I mean, and also in this being a sort of response to the preceding sections, you know, with Descartes and Husserl and such, when he puts it in quotes, when he says the center of actions and experiences, I've got a hunch that by experiences, he's full on referring to them, right? Where they set up that, you know, for instance, let's just take Descartes with the candle wax. It's the classic case when he's trying to develop his substance ontology, and he's saying, you know, there's this candle and it's like this, but now if I light it, then the wax could change. Well, he's in that mode of encounter. He's you know, it's like a subject-object relation, and he's trying to describe an experience within that framework. And I think when I read this, that he's saying that if you fixate on any given object when you're trying to develop your ontology, then you're going to miss its ground, right? And so it's kind of like I guess it's you know, like Gestalt psychology. There's like the figure and the ground, and yeah, I think that's one of the big things about presence at hand and presence ontology is that it takes the ground for granted.
I wanted to add that, so because in the next chapter he gets into moods, that may have some, it's really interesting, Andy, that you use the phrase head on, like you can't describe your desire, take it head on, because there's this notion of challenging something, like challenging it forth, and sort of demanding that it assert itself or that it, you know, be true, versus coming at it from an angle suggests sort of a gentler approach to reality that like teasing out or easing in, you know. And I wonder if that has something to do, it just seems, I'm not sure entirely why, it seems that might have something to do with mood and how our thrownness into, I didn't understand that section, so I'm not going to try to speak Heideggerese about it. But how mood shapes our way of being in our encounters with the world, I guess. It's not like we don't just exist in the, what is it, the lumen natural, or the light of reason, like he says on page 171 when he's talking about how Dasein is its disclosedness. We are how we disclose the world where we are at, you know? Right. And so you can't just use this, like, I guess, challenge that's like purely linguistic and descriptive.
Right, because I mean, if you think about the scientist or the, you know, the stereotypical researcher that he's trying to respond to, who thinks that they can get the closest approximation of truth, or maybe the only kind of knowledge that really gets at the truth through one of these present at hand analyses. he says in the following sentence, after the one about experiences and the centers of actions on 155, he says, Dasein finds itself proximally in what it does, uses, expects, and avoids. This is later on through other theorists going to get developed as a way of thinking about the scientists in the lab. There's not this objective. You're not just like literally analyzing these things. There's how you go about it. There's also like your field of possibilities, and there's what you care about that's involved in all of that.
And your ontological understanding.
Right.
I feel you can go ahead.
No, Jacob.
Okay, well, I feel like y'all are making this a little bit more complicated than it is. And I think that Heidegger is pretty clear about what he's doing at the top of page 155 with the phrase existentially, not categorically. That seems to be like the whole thing that he's putting forward in this chapter, is that we can't think about Dasein as a category. We can't think about the they as a category. We can only think about it existentially. That's what he's trying to do. And there's this phrase that I don't know where it originates, but he says it in the introduction of 1,000 Plateaus. It goes something like, the question is not whether it is true, but whether it works. And I think something similar is going on here. We're not interested in like the factual ontological claims about things in the world. We're interested in the how and the why of those things. We're interested in the how and the why of Dasein. So we're not trying to answer the question, what is Dasein? We're trying to answer the question, how is Dasein? Or who is Dasein? And if we switch that mode of thought, that's what he's trying to escape. He's trying to escape what I am to how I am, or who I am, because that it seems to be more meaningful to him. And I think I don't like to use the term meaning or think about things having meaning, but that seems to me too to be a much more interesting question than what is Dasein.
Absolutely. Agreed. What were you going to say, Mark?
That was just back to, I guess if the question is what, maybe that actually helps clarify what I was getting ready to ask. Because in this little section that Sammy read from, it says only when it looks away from experiences, and then what Dave then read on is Dasein finds itself proximally in what it does, uses, expects, avoids. Basically the question, or what I'm thinking is the what it does is different from just the looking at what it experiences, right? And maybe it's not even worth spending too much time on this little section, but yeah, the what it does seems to be what is really important to understand, rather than like, because it's like one's own Dasein becomes something that it can itself proximally come across only when it looks away from experiences in the center of its actions. Because what it does, the things that it does in circumspection are what's really important, or what really is where you begin to understand how Dasein is in the world. Does that make sense? Probably not.
It all made sense right until the very last half of the last sentence. It was rushed and I didn't get the last part. You sped it up to say, does that make sense? And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, now I can't remember what I said.
I think that the gist of what you're saying made total sense. And so I think that, yeah. Also that, I mean, it's this just that sentence alone really sets you up for kind of the last section, or last two sections of where we were at in chapter 5 for this week, which is to say that like Dasein is its possibilities, Dasein is its projections. There is never Dasein not projecting. Dasein's always in the act of projecting possibilities. And when we say does, uses, expects, and avoids, those are all about possibilities and projections. So that this is all preempting that, in the next chapter.
I think there's one more important point I just wanted to bring out because it recurs over and over like most important points do in Heidegger. So he says that others are not encountered basically by a primary act of looking at oneself in such a way that the opposite pole of a distinction first gets ascertained. They are encountered from out of the world in which concernfully circumspective Dasein essentially dwells. And then he says others are encountered environmentally. So, same one, 155. Same paragraph.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
So this is breaking down that, like, well, I know, and I can't remember where it is later, but he talks about this sort of idea that we know ourselves, and so then to know other people, we project what we know about ourselves onto them, and he thinks that it's fundamentally erroneous because we are being with others first and foremost, and that comes even before self-knowledge. You aren't born knowing about yourself and then like experiencing someone else and then projecting. Like, it doesn't have that linear quality. And he doesn't explicitly say it, but I think right there you could slide in a sort of analysis of what childhood is like, or what it's like to be an infant, where like you're completely dependent upon others and with others, and their possibilities are your possibilities before you have any awareness of their existence or yours. You are just sort of existing before, like, it just seems so obvious when you talk about it developmentally that existing precedes knowing. Mm-hmm. And so then it becomes even more obvious how this sort of ontology I don't want to say attacking, but he's undermining, is mistaken.
Yeah, Sammy, I was going to say that very thing. This whole paragraph just screams Winnicott to me, and the idea even of environment as persons as comprising the cosmos or the environment that sees you really before you see it, which is going to start to really resonate with Merleau-Ponty and other phenomenologists as this really respectful thing, but it could also be this really narcissistic thing because it's kind of a loop, a kind of feedback loop. But I really, and again, he's like right on the edge of that. So he's sort of like right on the edge of the primary act of looking at oneself, right? But it's from the environment, which is just this really lovely description of early life.
Yeah, the environment is, I agree, and I think I didn't realize before we really dug in how essential this text would be for understanding everything that comes after it. Like, I knew it was, but there's like all these little bits where you'll just be like, oh my gosh, that's kind of where Derrida seems to get his whole thing, or like, not as if it's a direct like causal link, where you're just like, well, this is like the seeds of this other movement, or this is the seeds of that. Like, it just is sort of chock full of those moments.
See.
So let's just say a little bit about, like, just I guess just for the sake of anyone tuning in, if they're just like, what's going on here? The big step, I think, and correct me if you have an idea otherwise. The big thing happening in chapter 4 is like this: the moment when the first 3 chapters could have been seen as somewhat solipsistic. There's just Dasein and this world. But in the beginning chapters, he says we're going to unpackage this being in the world thing very carefully, and you can't think about any part of this this conjunction without thinking about the rest of it that we'll be talking about. Always keep the rest of it in mind. And this is the part when he brings in that we are always being with. And I mean, this applies to Robinson Crusoe as much as it does any hermit, right? He says you can be alone in a crowd just as much as you can be with others, when you're on the island alone. I mean, he doesn't say the island, but the basic idea is that our being with is the constitution of any possibility for our experiencing of the world, or for our projecting our possibilities. And I like the example that Braver uses, which is a lot more simple than other ways I've been thinking about it, but it's just, just going off of the tool analysis. We know ourselves in a world of referential totalities and involvements by the fact that, to do anything, we're always putting all of these other things to use. Those other things, though, as he says in this chapter, were already given to us or set up by others and made available by others. We use the hammer like other people use the hammer. If you want to become a professor, or if you want to become a plumber, you're becoming something that's been set out by others. And so the equipment that comes with that and the meaning that comes with that, all of this stuff is by others. And so, I mean, the very significance of the referential totalities, whether they're through the actual physical tools or through linguistic signs, any kind of meaning here is going to be set up by that being with that is part of our being in the world. You think, Ty?
I'm not going to say anything because I'm going to draw some analogies that are probably way off base. Okay. So when I was reading through this, I thought about the fact that we're establishing Dasein. And through the process, Dasein is given the ability to, I'm going to use some really non-appropriate words. Dasein is given the ability of free will to decide. Okay, I don't know what we're deciding yet, but we're given this decision to decide. And so I'm following along with, okay, so Dasein represents, as we go into chapter 4, I. And then there's the they. And if you've been around as long as I have, they said everything. And what I know is that what they said to me 40 years ago, they said wrong now. So I have like a certain dubious relationship with they. I understand they and how they can formulate so much of my life. For God's sakes, I'm an architect. I've been conditioned since I was a little tiny baby to become an architect. Along those lines, then I go into the I here and this being thrown in. And I'm, again, incorrect, but I think of the analogy of a potter, okay? Who knows who the potter's forces are, but there's a wheel spinning and there's a lump of clay. And the potter throws that lump of clay onto the wheel, throws. Mm-hmm. It's a physical act of throwing, and then forces a vessel out of it. Right. And that vessel, essentially, the way I relate to it, contains Dasein and is shaped by all of the forces of the environment around it. Now, still, Dasein by itself is an emptiness within a vessel. But as soon as you start to fill it with anything, it becomes useful in some way or the other. Mm. And the place where I stopped with moods in chapter 5 was that it's the mood of both the thing inside. So it's the air and the air temperature inside. They know that. Okay, those are laws of physics. They know that. And it's the forces from the outside that shape the vessel. And no two vessels are alike if they're each created individually. Yeah. Okay. So somewhere through that whole process, I found myself thinking of, we start off in a science fiction hive mentality, and yet our theyness and our mood and our own ability to decide, okay, whatever that is inside the vessel, okay, that thing inside there, that space, affects what we choose to be, not what we choose to become, what we become. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes you make choices along the way, but it's in relationship to that vayness out there. So it's like, yeah, okay, I'm getting to this. At least from my standpoint of science fiction, I can understand a vessel with Dasein inside of it, or outside of it, or defining it, or between. It is. Right.
Oh, yeah. Even the between, because it's a separateness, which is erroneous.
But I think that's always been an issue with the hive mentality. again, I'm thinking mostly of Rick and Morty, but the Hyde mentality stops short of who am I? It stops with the who are we? And there's a difference between a we and an I.
I think I like that you got a personal analogy out of it. Yeah, that was a good one, because I think there is a sort of poetic value to the word throne, and the fact that we are shaped not only by the outside, by the potter. It's not as if we're literally shaped only by outside forces by the day, but like also by our own choices or possibilities or whatever.
Jim Morrison talks about it in The Doors. Okay, we are thrown into this world. So it's been part of my vocabulary for a long time.
I wonder.
Go ahead.
I wonder. I really like the analogy of the pottery and the thrown onto the wheel. My only question would be, where is the having been with in this thrownness? Because Dasein is thrown, having always already been with the world that Dasein is in, right? Because I think that we'll get to this more in the temporal aspect. In the end of our reading today, in chapter 5, started to really give a little bit of a hint at how that temporal aspect is going to come in. And at one point, he even says, we can't really ever understand what I've said so far without the temporal aspect.
Yeah.
And I think, from what I recall, projecting has a temporal dimension to it, right? We project the present. And so I really like this analogy of the pottery, and I wonder how it can be more fully fleshed out, perhaps, or whether it can at all be more fully fleshed out. I don't know if it can.
Can I just ask a question to clarify?
Yeah.
Would the temporal aspect that you're talking about, Jacob, would that possibly be the potential for the jug that's always in the clay?
I don't know if Heidegger likes that talk about potential like that.
When I guess that's what I'm confused about in terms of this chapter, because he does talk a lot about how, I mean, he does talk a lot about potential, but I guess I don't. What is it about that specific characterization of potential that you would say Heidegger would go against?
So I can't remember exactly where the part on potential and potentiality is, but I remember he's pretty clear, and I don't know if he gives a distinction between possibility and potential, but he seems pretty clear that possibility is not, as we usually think about possibility, as contingency. Instead, possibility is an existential, and Dasein is always already Dasein is the possibility. So possibility was something I was trying hard to wrap my head around, but it seems a lot different than how we usually think about possibility as like possible worlds or something like that. And it seems different than a Deleuzean virtual, which has how I was initially thinking about it. It seems, and this is probably going to be a really bastardized way of saying it, but the actualities are the possibility. The actualities of Dasein are the possibilities of Dasein.
Partially, but there's also like this other aspect. He says that, so there's the normal way we think about it, where this thing is an actual instantiation of a possibility. It could have been otherwise, but this is how it is. Therefore, this is the actual, which is the normal way that possibility is conceived, both for Deleuze and for Heidegger. They both point that out as the commonsensical way. But then for Dasein, though, so for this, its positive characteristics are what it is because it's present in hand. But for us, for Dasein, our positive characteristics are in our possibilities that are not actualized. So, and the way that I was thinking about this, the way that to make it most human, or like, there's an element, I don't know if he would want to go, well, I'll just say it. So you just take a bare person and you analyze them, you're essentially looking at, I mean, if you think about it in a scientific way, it might as well be a corpse, except that you're saying that it can go do things. But if you're doing this existential analytic, you don't know anything about that person without knowing its particular history, which is its thrownness. So if it turns out that we use Harry Potter, you take, without knowing that he grew up under the stairs, and he wasn't allowed to ever go out and do anything. There's a huge part about his story that's missing, and it's those possibilities for having a childhood, for having experiences that most children would generally be able to get, to go play, to be able to run free or whatever, that to have friends. The negations of those possibilities are constitutive and therefore positive existential characteristics of that particular Dasein.
So I kind of have two questions, and the first is something off of what you're saying and what Jacob is saying. So you both are talking about existential, right? So Jacob is talking about how it's not we shouldn't be thinking of Dasein as categorical. We should be thinking of it as existential. And you're talking about an existential analytic. And Jacob's kind of talking about existentiality. And that term comes up in Heidegger. I mean, I guess I know what I associate with that term. How is everyone else reading that term? What does it mean to be existential? That's just...
What an existential question.
I have a few ideas, but does anyone want to suffer some guesses or give some opinions?
I just always think existence precedes essence, just meaning a turn in philosophy whereby experience, lived experience, is the foundation of the categories, which are abstractions of those actual occasions and events, and that it's not the reverse. There's no essential human stuff without being in the world in time and space context.
And I have definitely, I think I'm kind of coming from the same background. The existence precedes essence. I associate existential, I associate the word existential with agency, with choice, with self-definition, with the ability to determine one's own future, especially against maybe biological constraints or I don't know, but I don't feel like that's how y'all are really using this term.
That sounds like Sartre. Sorry.
Yeah.
It feels like y'all are coming at this term from a very different angle. Is that correct?
Yeah.
It's not existentialist, it's existential.
So yes, what would be the difference, I guess?
So on page 163, he gives, which I think is the first time I've seen him kind of define existential. So at the beginning of section 27, he says the ontologically relevant result of our analysis of being with is the insight of the subject character of one's own Dasein, and that of others is to be defined existentially. That is, in terms of certain ways in which one may be. So, I don't know, and then it continues in that.
I guess just going back to the conversation we were having a little bit earlier, Jacob, if I look at a block of clay and I see possibilities for that clay beyond what the clay is currently, why wouldn't those be potential? Why wouldn't those be potentialities for that? Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, I see what you're saying. I don't know if existential goes beyond Dasein, though.
So
I just wanted
someone else probably better.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to continue to the rest of the sentence, Jacob, which is they are what they do. So potential is, I think if you're rejecting potential, it has something to do with an Aristotelian notion of an inborn telos, that the potential is sort of predetermined essentially, and that what you do conforms to it as an end of history or yourself or whatever. And then existential would be sort of a reverse of that you do stuff and then you are that.
Right.
This is a kind of maybe a dumb follow-up, but has anyone read The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman? It's a children's book.
Years.
I
read the
wish my
trilogy.
mom thought it was the devil, which it kind of is, I
It
guess.
is.
It is.
Was anyone else kind of thinking of the demons or the daemons or however you pronounce it, like the children? I don't know. Who said they read it?
It's been so long I don't remember it.
I read it, but I don't remember too much.
I remember the daemons
So-
and not knowing how to pronounce
I remember the
them.
knife in the sequel.
Basically, one of the big concepts of the series is that people they have their souls on the outside of their body, and children have souls that can turn into like different types of animals. But once you get older, it settles sort of into. Never mind. If people haven't read the book, it doesn't matter. It's a bad example.
But you're saying it's sort of set out.
No,
for-
it's great. Keep going.
Well, all of the discussion about potentiality, the idea in the book is like, as a child, your soul is on the outside of your body and it takes the form of an animal. And, you know, if you're a child and you're frightened, it might take the form of an animal that kind of manifests that fear, like a mouse or a moth or something like that. Or, you know, it might take the form of an animal that represents kind of some aspect of your personality. But it's the soul, or the daemon, as it's called in the book, is like constantly changing. And that's supposed to represent the infinite potential of a child, right? A child is born not knowing what it's going to become or what its nature is. It's only through certain interactions with others and being in the world with others that it kind of figures out who it is, and then that self sort of settles. And I think up until the point where the self settles, it kind of reminded me of some of the things that Heidegger is saying about potentiality.
I would say that's even well, yeah, there's kind of a possible analogy there, because there's it's almost like there are certain possibilities, certain ways set out by the they that you are thrown into, and so it's proposed that you should settle into a way of being, and that there are right ways and wrong ways, but then there's a section that I thought was really interesting, and then we can get to what Jacob said, because it's
Yeah, Jacob shared something that should
it's
clear things up.
yes. But let's see real quick.
I just wanted to point out that in the books, the servants are always dogs. They always have the souls of dogs. So there's a weird, like, socioeconomic determinism or something going on.
Yeah. Members of the church are always reptiles.
So not just socioeconomic.
Yeah, no, I would highly recommend the series for anyone who hasn't read it. If you like, you know, young adult fiction.
Okay, so so this possibilities. Actually, let's just deal with what Jacob said, because what I had this thing written down, and I'm
So Jacob, would you like to either kind of paraphrase it, or one of us could read it out loud?
Yeah, because I can't read.
I can read it.
I can read it. It's just most of it's just a quote from 176. I also have a question about possibility for later if we want to continue talking about that.
Well, I did want to dig in a little deeper into the difference between logical possibility and existential possibility, because I think that will help answer, or at least reply to Andy's question.
Well, I'm just wondering if it has to do with like the openness of the future. Does it have so Dasein is thrown into a world where it's always already been with the past, and it projects in the present and is going towards this open future, right? So is its potentiality like, so thinking about it like a circle, Dasein, the present, it draws upon the past, and that presents the possibility for its future trajectory. Not in a deterministic or teleological way, but the past provides the potential for the open future of Dasein. Does it have to do with the future? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yes, to the simple answer, I wrote in my note for page 185, Dasein as future, right? Because the existential structure of understanding, which we'll get into, the existential structure of understanding is projection. All understanding of Dasein is as possibilities, which means that Dasein is in a sense like this living in the future, which it means that we're in a way living in a field of possibilities, many of which aren't going to become actual in our lifetimes, but will be defined by many of the ones that don't become actual. You know, I will always be defined by the fact that, you know, it will always be a definitive characteristic that I did not, or that we did not get my parents' farm in the campaign this year, right? That's going to be, and you know, in good ways and in bad ways, you know, but I think all in net positive, but like, yeah, that's, I mean, if that had happened, things would have been very different. And the fact that it didn't happen, I learned all these things from that. But it was the living as though that possibility might happen that formed a lot of the ways that I began thinking and living. And so even though that possibility never materialized, it had these actual positive impacts in shaping the way things are and will be.
Can I offer a second example that's a little darker?
Yes.
We're always defined by the possibility that our loved ones could die, right? In some ways, love is constituted through the lens of that possibility. When we think about how much someone means to us, what we're really thinking about is the possibility that they're not there. And though that possibility hasn't been made manifest, it still defines us in a very real way. Is that...
And that, yeah, I think that's also like the content of an existential crisis, as we'd call it, where, I mean, I actually just had one 2 days ago. It was weird, you know, and for me, it's always triggered by seeing something like change on my body, like a new wrinkle, or just like being like, whoa, 3 years ago, this wasn't here. And then, or this thing has changed. And then you're just like, someday this whole thing is not going to be at all the same. And you're like, well, someday it's just not going to be here. And then it kind of makes you think, well, what am I doing? Like, in light of that fact. And I mean, that's the stereotypical existential crisis, but I think we are always, if we're not in the mode of everydayness, where we're just going around doing our things and like interacting with people in the mode of the day, when something like blocks you off from that mode of everydayness, you have to, you face a sort of crisis where you have to think about possibilities and being different, something being different than it is at that moment. And you have to, like, I don't know.
It's also really, I mean, so Andy, you're really preempting either the latter half of 5 or the chapter 6, because death is Dasein's onos potentiality for being.
It seems like Dasein would have to like at least be aware of its own. I don't know. Yeah, sorry. Keep going.
No, yeah.
It seems like death would be the awareness of death would be the defining criteria. Like, not to categorize the way Jacob was talking about, but like that would be
right. There's
not really, yeah.
The stuff he's saying in 5. And I do think we should at some point jump to the last couple pages of 4, but this stuff is just perfect for right now. And that's that there's, in all of this stuff about mood and, or state of mind, which is a bad interpretation.
Very
for
bad.
multiple reasons.
And then they even admit it's bad and then they keep using it.
They admit it's bad and they keep using it. But all of this stuff about mood, the reason that he goes with the example of fear, he says that there are other existentials that make up the structure of Dasein's projections. But he goes with fear because it's going to be an illuminating case, because he says that you might notice him talking about falling and about fleeing. And we can find some concrete examples here in a second, or we can just come back to that later. But just the basic idea is like, he'll get there. We are always fleeing in the face of our own mortality, of death. And one of the things that causes a breakdown of the average everydayness ready to hand of our normal ways of being in the world is death. And so those things shake us up out of it a little bit. And that confrontation, well, there's different, we can either confront it, you know, which he would say, he calls that taking a resolute stand on your own most potentiality for being, or you can continue, you can flee back harder, you can flee harder back into the they.
Which he hasn't got to yet.
He hasn't quite got to it yet, but that's what he's building up to here in 5 when he talks about moods. And
yeah, because he says in the beginning that there's going to be a whole section on the falling,
right,
which we just haven't got to yet. I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? He hasn't really hit that yet.
No.
But next week. I like the primer though.
The one thing I really just to Andy's first question, before we go wherever this takes us next, I just want to make sure to bring this up because this part on 183 in the little more than halfway down of the first paragraph on 183, where he says the being possible, which Dasein is existentially in every case, is to be sharply distinguished both from empty logical possibility and from the contingency of something present at hand, so far as with the present at hand, this or that can come to pass.
Wait, sorry.
So the part I kind of wanted to emphasize is this empty logical possibility, which analytic philosophy, when you get into modal metaphysics or modal logic, it's all about this empty logical possibility. And just by talking about it for a second, I think it's illuminating this difference between the categorical way of thinking about beings and then the existential way of thinking about being. And that would be, so for instance, with Saul Kripke or with David Lewis in contemporary analytic philosophy, both these guys are still alive. Logical possibility is, when we're doing metaphysics, we say, well, is it, if it's possible, if it could be in like any possible world, then it's logically possible. And so it's like dealing in this sort of low stakes, super low stakes kind of philosophy, where like ultimately it doesn't freaking matter, to me at least, because I want to know what's possible in my life and in our life. For instance, like if you're reading history, it's not really interesting to take the brute facts of history, if there were such a thing, as at face value. It's more interesting to think, well, how could it have been, and how is it that what if this one crucial thing had not happened, and then that helps you think about your own life and the impact of certain events.
Like, what if
that's existential possible.
What if assassinated?
Or what if in the Cuban Missile Crisis, like they had just turned the keys to the the launch codes?
Or what if Hitler,
or a team of mutants had intervened?
Huh?
You haven't seen X-Men?
No.
Not all of them. Which one?
The one with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Come on.
oh, right.
Oh.
Yeah, or what if Hitler's dad had actually let him pursue his artistic,
or when he didn't fail the entrance exam.
No, if he hadn't failed the entrance exams for the art school.
I wanted to point out a passage that this all made me think of, actually, on page 163. It's the end of that first paragraph.
163?
Yeah. It says, this inconsiderate being reckons with the others without seriously counting on them, without even wanting to have anything to do with them. And I was thinking there's this way of reckoning with like history or possibility without seriously counting on it or wanting anything to do with it, right? It's just like it could be this way, it could be that way. But like there's this notion of involvement. And the reason that this stuck out to me is because I was like, well, this could be such a cogent critique of philosophy as it currently stands. as an inhumane science, social science, right? Because like you just have like we have these studies on all the subjects, the aggregate, the average subjects. You know, we did this poll and then we did this study and it's representative, blah blah blah.
Thinking in terms of populations.
Thinking in terms of populations, and then they act this way in this circumstance. But there's rarely a question of like who those people were. There's no, it's almost never like, right? Or there's no real counting on them. Like they're literally numerals, like they're literally numbers in the study. Because like, you know, 5 people drop out, you're like, oh, damn it, we had 5 African American men drop out. We need to go find 5 more with all these other qualifiers so that our study is still representative. It's not, and so that's why I feel like a lot of times that sort of social science either comes up with these banal, just like obvious, common sense things. It's like, well, now science has said it's true. Humans do believe this way, like behave this way.
That's how market studies work. Yeah.
Right.
Oh, right.
Or
Study shows people are afraid of death.
right. No, have you seen? There was literally one that did that.
Yeah.
It's
it wasn't from the
balancing
Onion.
your checkbook. You reconcile with the bank, and if the bank says you have more money than you say you do, you always take that higher number. You know, it's like, it's immaterial to me. If it's wrong, it's their fault, not mine.
Yeah, it's like this total
I mean,
lack.
we reckon all the time for all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, I reckon this is close enough to the speed limit.
But I guess the possibility, or that's, and then the other possibility for those studies is often that they just get things fundamentally wrong, or those studies become part of the they that people refer to. And this gets back to what I wanted to say a while ago. Oh shit! I lost
165 in particular is a good way of picking up on that.
Just remember, they were wrong, and I believe them.
So, yeah, 165. That's where it was actually. Thank you, Dave. In obscuring, the public always gets it right because it is insensitive to the difficult heart of the matter, which is questioning. Things are passed off as or seem easy and familiar, right? So, like, when it comes down to making a difficult decision, like Heidegger is kind of snarkily like, well, it's always there, and it seems like it's always stolen away whenever Dasein presses for a decision. It's like everyone's opinions are always there, like telling you what is right and what is wrong, but as soon as you need to take a stand and make a decision, they're not there because it's like, oh, you know, that's on you. And so the lack of answerability, but then the omnipresent, like, opinionation. It reminds me of, like, I used to be, and I still somewhat am, whenever faced with a really difficult decision, I had this habit of literally Googling it. Even if it was like, what to do when this situation in your relationship happens, or like, you know, if it was something that totally shouldn't be Googleable, or how do you tell if someone really likes you? Like, it was just those sort of humane.
There was a
How
Saturday
to
Night
flirt
Live
with someone. You
from
know?
a million years ago. Kill my landlord. Kill my landlord.
Like Google?
I will not pay my rent. I will kill my landlord. No, it was Saturday Night Live before there was even Google. We had poets talking on national TV late at night about the realities of making bad decisions.
That never happened.
It did too. It was a play. No, it was on Saturday Night Live. Look it up. Eddie Murphy. Kill my landlord. Huh?
Take it back to Sammy. Well, and so really, like, so and this is, you know, speaking in terms of populations and speaking in terms of and about the they, in reference to the they. This is something that I really wanted to like let's dive in on pages 164 and 165 for sure. Probably the most important pages in chapter 4. Maybe the next 2. Whatever. Those are some 4 heavy-hitting pages. Oh no, Andy, go ahead.
I was just going to say what Sam was talking about Google and what you were, the part. Am I echoing someone?
No, you sound fine to us.
Okay. Anyway, what Sammy was saying about Google and what the part of of Heidegger that you're kind of talking about, the I versus they thing, right? That's what you're getting at, right?
Well,
yeah.
Roughly. What the they.
What they is. I was thinking of social media and how it allows people to construct this like fantasy of, you know, I am an individual addressing this audience, you know, and kind of suspend that reality, which is that like everyone else is an individual addressing that audience of which you are a part. Does that?
Yeah. Okay. So Andy, you'd probably find it really interesting. So I'm just going to throw it out there, and I probably still have access to the PDF, so I could send it to you. Hubert Dreyfus, before he died
This year.
This year, rest his soul, not bless his soul, rest his
Does
soul.
he have a soul?
I don't know. Rest his Dasein.
R.I.P. that Dasein.
But he wrote an essay on Kierkegaard, and it's clearly got Heidegger all over and all in it, and it's about the internet and leveling down and the they, and it's really fascinating, and the public and the no one, and so yeah, that it perfectly maps. In fact, I think social media maps onto this even more than anything else Heidegger brings up.
Especially if you think about situations where social media tries and convicts innocent people for things that they haven't done. So like I was just reading an article about someone who was trying to help a little girl find her parents, and this person's face was plastered all on social media. He was a child molester. He's, you know, like, I mean, it basically ruined his life, you know, because he was trying to help this little girl. And to me, that was a perfect example of how something can happen, but no one is responsible.
Right. That's the very phenomenon that's most disturbing. What did Jacob say?
And that's what scares me about social media. It's like no one's responsible, but it has but like the cumulative actions of everyone have a very real type of agency and impact on others. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and he even says that because even though the they is not like a sum, so it's not a sum of everybody. It's not. I don't remember, but it's still not nothing. That's the strange thing about it. It's not an aggregate of every single person, and it's not a bunch of subjects. But it's still not nothing. It's this whole other phenomenon in itself. The last thing I wanted to say, why I brought up all of the other stuff, was that every time I would read those internet articles, though, and I'd always read a bunch of them, you know, that were all giving advice or like how to do it best, how to do this best. And every time when it gets to the situation, you always just end up doing something that they didn't tell you to do. And then you're just like, either you feel guilty about it because you're immature and you don't realize the reality, or you're just like, you know what? I read all that and it helped me see like all of the possibilities that these people limited themselves to. And I found my possibility is something else. And then eventually you're just like, stop looking to Google for advice on like serious life matters. But I guess that's the sort of becoming one's or becoming authentic, being one's own in a way, because reality takes hold of you in your own way, right? And so you're slowly easing out of things taking hold of you in the prescribed way.
Looks like Jacob had. There's something I definitely want to touch on here, but I want first. Like, it looks like Jacob has something to bring.
Not really. I just think about the they in a similar way that I think about like normativity in Foucault or the image of thought in Deleuze. It's like, as Deleuze says, what everyone knows, no one can deny. That seems to be the they. Whatever the they posits, it's kind of what everybody just accepts. And living inauthentically, and this is where I saw the Nazism, which I mentioned in the chat. There's this sort of domination of the they, and it isn't moralized either way. It's just kind of given as like an empirical definition. And to live inauthentically seems to be to just go along with the normativity, whereas to live authentically is to, and I read this as similar to Nietzsche's Übermensch, and I can see where Sartre kind of went off with existentialism here, even though there's another part in the chapter where he clearly goes against Sartre's existentialism. It might be what I already posted that in the sidebar, the deal with matter coming beforehand. But the authenticity seems to be to understand oneself and to come from your own position rather than blindly going along with the image of thought. And again, this isn't he doesn't moralize it, but it's, and where it might be different than Nietzsche, I don't know if he says anything about authenticity guiding the they. And I feel like Nietzsche might do that, but I don't have a very good understanding of Nietzsche either, so.
I just get, okay, so I'm confused whenever people talk about authenticity and Nazism, because for me the connection hasn't really been drawn, and I'm just curious.
No, I don't think about authenticity as Nazism. I'm thinking about inauthenticity in Nazism.
Well, right, but like the seeds of Heidegger's Nazism, how could that be? Because it seems like I've heard and read people saying that his whole division between inauthenticity and authenticity has something to do with his Nazism.
It's somehow fascist, yeah.
I just don't get it, I guess.
I think
Look at the quotes that made me think it.
What's that?
He's finding a quote.
So just a follow-up question, I guess. I like the idea of I kind of like what you're saying about normativity. To me, normativity, there's always kind of an implied punishment, I guess, or regulatory aspect for people who step outside of normative ways of being or normative categories, or, you know, is that something that you're seeing here, Jacob?
I don't see it here, but I just mean to say I definitely see Heidegger's influence on Foucault through this.
Totally.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So
sorry, go ahead.
Go.
I guess I didn't even consider normativity, but one thing I was kind of thinking about was the political group Anonymous. Is anyone familiar with like their structure and how they organize decision making?
I'm not familiar enough, I'm sure.
So the whole idea of Anonymous is it's kind of an umbrella for various groups or cabals of like individuals who are kind of working together. It's hard to explain. There's no central organized structure. There's no. It's like about as fluid as you can possibly get with a political organization. So all of the decision making happens on like encrypted chat rooms in these kind of big sort of crowd think. Damn it! I'm so bad at explaining this. Sorry, go ahead. I think someone's trying to talk.
No.
Well, I've come up with where I was thinking about Heidegger's Nazism, and it starts on 164. So he gives a description of the they on 164. Maybe it's not 164, but somewhere in the book he gives a distinction that the they is not like a general category. It's still a particular sort of group. Like there can be a they, like a nation might be a they, or a family might be a they. So I was thinking about the they specifically in terms of a nation. Now on the bottom of 165 is where I wrote, I can feel the Nazi Heidegger here. And it's not very explicit. I just felt it very subtly. The whole time I was reading through this section, I was like, oh, there's tinges of the Nazism here. It's not overbearing, but I can feel it there. And maybe it's just because I know Heidegger was a Nazi that I feel that it's there, but I definitely feel it there. And it starts here. Thus the particular Dasein in its everydayness is disturbed by the they. Not only that, by thus disturbing it of its being, the they accommodates Dasein, if Dasein has any tendency to take things easily and make them easy. And because the they constantly accommodates the particular Dasein, By disturbing it of its being, the they retain and enhances its stubborn dominion. And I think it's this next line that really had me feeling it. Everyone is the other, and no one is himself. The they, which supplies the answer to the question of the who of the everyday Dasein, is the nobody to whom every Dasein has already surrendered itself in being among one another. And it kind of had this element of like the Nazi groupthink, sort of like surrendering themselves to the greater cause of the they. And it's not explicit. It's not like I can say this is explicitly Heidegger being a Nazi, but there's this underlying tone that just makes me uncomfortable while reading this.
Well, so when he says the particular Dasein and its everydayness is disburdened by the they, and that they accommodate it by, I mean, I took note of that too.
So do you remember in the previous, okay, on 158, on the last paragraph of 158, when he talks about the two different ways that solicit, there's two primary ways of solicitude. One where, I mean, the easy example is like everyone has basic needs, right? And you know, responsibilities. Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there's two ways of being with another in this context. And one is to leap in for him. He says him, so I'll just use it because I'm reading it. But yeah, you can leap in for him, or you can, go ahead, right? And this is the basic. You can teach a person how to fish, or you can just give them the fish, right? And I was listening to a lecture where they expanded on this notion. I forget who it was, but they said that that in old folks' home or senior care centers or what have you, when you're being trained to work there as a CSA, one of the first things they'll teach you is you do not take over responsibilities for the people there that they can do themselves, because at this point in their life, that's the only thing giving them meaning anymore. And in the exact same way, when it comes to child rearing, at the point that someone can start doing something for themselves, you need to be trying to prop them up to enable them, to empower them to be able to do so, because otherwise they become, they're reliant on you, and if they're not on you, then they will be on others. So that's really what he's getting at here. But he uses the word, and this is crucial. He uses the word disburden halfway through that, right? And I'll read that sentence, and then I want to I've been marking every instantiation of disburden because this is really interesting here. He says, the other is thus thrown out of his own position. He steps back to that afterwards when the matter has been attended to. Like imagine the parent washing the dishes for the child, So he's been removed from that responsibility. He can either take it over as something finished and it's at his disposal, or disburden himself of it completely. Right? He has the option to not even think about this thing, for it to fade into the background. Well, that is what the they does for all of us constantly. There's 1,000 things working in the background and people working in the background at all times, especially in an advanced civilization. You're never really aware of how many things are going on in the background, taking over things for you. Right? Like you get in your car and you drive away because you paid a bunch of money. You don't realize how many thousands of people and hundreds of hours or millions of hours went into
making sure you could get to work faster.
What's underneath the skin of that car.
Right. Or let alone the road you drive on, let alone the trees that were planted on the side of the road in the shopping centers.
Well, and this all putting the skin over the engine of the car and making you think that it's a holistic unity. Separating yourself from the fact that there's so much stuff going on there, it disburdens your consciousness of all the stuff so that you can focus on your ultimate for the sake of which is being a career person in order to driving, using the car in order to get there.
Why do I have to be the example?
Oh, sorry.
I think another example would be the algorithms that choose your movies for you on Netflix.
Right, like I'm guilty of using all the time Spotify's suggestions. I'm just like, I don't know, like it's okay, and then also I think it correlates with the complexity of a civilization, Because imagine the only music I could listen to was the music that my friends around me could make or that I could make myself. My choices are pretty limited. Like, I mean, and it depends on the mood and like blah, blah, blah. But then you log on to Spotify, there's millions, maybe billions of songs. There's so many songs. How do you know where to start? Well, you let the algorithms, tell you where to start. You look at recommendations, and recommendations are always as they. Yelp is the they.
Or Google.
Or Google.
Mm-hmm.
But
Or Facebook.
But also, I wanted to say, like, as far as career paths, I know that if you just, or like ways of living, I mean, it seeps into everything. We think that maybe like heterosexual monogamy is the default. That is, it's just taken as a given for the child that like you're a girl, you like boys. And then maybe if that you find out later that, oh, they don't, then it's like, oh, you're an aberration from the they, like the they is like telling you what is normal, I guess. And it makes life easier though, because then your options are so much more limited. And like, right. And then you also serve a function and you have a purpose, and like you go and you can get married and you have the babies and you can get the tax break and you can serve the state in this and that way. So like you serve the they, but they're also the they accommodates you while it disburdens you. And this is the state, I feel like, in a sense. Because
I wanted to interrupt with the politics of this. So what's making me nervous about it in maybe an Ubermensch kind of way is how the they as the collective is inferior, basically. So there's a kind of, the authenticity that's available to some who really try, who can't be imposed upon by the proactive, now I'm just going to say it in like different language that's politically inflected, the proactive care of the group, translated as the state, the welfare intrusive mommy state that exhibits too much coddling, right? So that social security programs, the social safety net are these inhibitors of individuality and authentic human becoming, like instead of necessary to just fucking live and breathe and ride on a road or whatever. So I'm like arguing toward a kind of suspicion of elitism against something as proactive and burdensome as maternal fucking care.
Yeah, I think though that to me where that I thought of that too, but I guess I've just been listening to a lot of books about money and economics lately, and I think that's the problem, is that this idea, this sort of like idea that competition is the law of so the people who try are competing to get more resources or to be somehow more actualized. Well, money as a metaphor infects all our ways of thinking, especially when it comes to the state and to politics. And I think the welfare state is just too infected with the metaphor or the reality of economics to really be a parallel to I guess it is our historical situation, so it is an existential fact for us, but like just
I'm talking not about money. I mean, I'm not actually talking about actual distribution of resources. I'm really talking about people's attitudes about individuality, authenticity, and the overreach of government, not the actual overreach, or right? I mean, I'm talking about how this is gendered, right? How care is gendered, understandings of individuality are gendered, because to be authentic is to be in this relation of care, but just not too much, And I mean, I agree, like there is parental overreach that inhibits growth. That's absolutely true. But there's this anxiety, this huge libertarian anxiety that turns out, in my view, to just be super gendered around this stuff.
So do you mean that the idea of the overreaching mother or the absorbing mother, like That basically that they will disburden you to the point and accommodate you to the point of possessing you and you existing only for them. And that can kind of like play off of like parental anxieties.
This is Ayn Rand, basically, like people who help hurt by taking away your self-actualizing potential to stand on your own. Now, this is, in a sense, like solid parenting. That's really true. Parents should not overfunction, but there is a huge anxiety built into American identity that is masculinized around that very concern of just rejecting care as overweening, as imposing, as suffocating. And that's sort of like, I feel like the they is sort of gendered in the way of the state in this generic, anonymous, threatening. It's also enabling. So the analogy of the car and the highway are really true. Like you need to be unburdened of the realities of certain instances of the nitty-gritties of life in order to have like higher functioning thinking and stuff like that. But you also are indebted to all of those people who did all of that. And the fact that they go below notice is precisely the nature of maternal care. It's supposed to go below notice until you know that you're working with a human being and not just an environment, right? So
this is actually something I've kind of been curious about for a long time. If you don't mind me asking kind of a question here. So I think I understand what you're saying about the way that caring is gendered and how it can be really dangerous when it's co-opted by libertarians and kind of explain that way you're talking about how like the welfare state inhibits self-actualization, right? Do you think that the pendulum ever swings the other way in this conversation? Like, it feels like a lot of, weirdly enough, it feels like a lot of post-colonial feminists are making a similar argument about paternalism and about, like, I mean, I guess the difference would be Western intervention versus government intervention, right? Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know. Sorry, I'm really tired.
No, that's a really good, actually, parallel, I think, about parental overreach and metaphors of caring and co-opting, right? And I guess it would just depend upon whether you really think that the government, whether you think that the social security net actually is controlling and imposing its normativity on you, or whether like colonial forces really are doing those things, right? I mean,
well, I guess the analogy. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I guess post-colonial feminists, not all of them, obviously, but some of them would make a similar argument about foreign aid from the United States. Like, it's a form of paternalism, right? It's a way of framing people in other countries as children who are dependent on art. And to me, it's super interesting because it seems like radical libertarians and certain strains of post-colonial feminists are making like pretty much the same argument about paternalism. They're just making it in a different context. Is that?
Well, I think to relate it back to just the concept of the they, we're always accommodated by language because it always makes it possible to say things or to indicate things or communicate with other human beings, right? At the same time as it's disburdening us of really understanding things a lot of times. Like, if you just encounter a strange new object and you don't have a word for it, you have to just like really, like, it usually presents itself as a problem and you're just like, what is this? But when you have a concept for it, it's like, oh, it's this. It fits into this like referential totality. This is a pen. I use it to do this. And you instantly know like what to do. Right. And so it disburdened you of thinking through every possibility and figuring out what to do. There's like a sort of back and forth there where both of those are necessary. Like you need to be disburdened to some extent, but you also need to be able to stand on your own. And so like, as far as the metaphor of like foreign aid, for example, well, it's tricky because the reason a lot of these countries need foreign aid is because of fucked up shit we did. But like, or other countries did. So it's tricky, but like the concept of leveraging foreign aid as a way to import culture or to limit the possibilities of the people in that country to go help them start businesses, that's good, that's nice, and you're using all this rhetoric of helping, but like really now we can just get cheap shoes from India or something, you know? So there's like a certain balance that's needed there. And I mean, I just don't think like either way, I don't think it's helpful to moralize the disburdening accommodation thing. It's just a fact that it happens. And maybe the competitor's tone is a little anxious. And it's good that you pointed that out, Lydia, but I just don't think it's like as moralized as maybe we're speaking.
Well, and I did want to, so to take it back to the, so he's definitely not talking about the state necessarily, right? Like, I think that this state is going to be something that is made possible by the being with and the everyday kind of Dasein and the they and all of these things, but that it's and that I was using basic libertarian examples, you know, teach a man how to fish, blah blah blah. That's literally something that you hear from conservative dads, you know, like. But I mean, it's just, I mean, that is what this reminds you of. But I mean, it's also like, well, I mean, he's doing an existential analytic. Like, this is a part of our lived experience. Like, there are ways in which we are constantly being disburdened. And the thing is, he does kind of do, you know, he kind of sets it up like he uses some ominous adjectives to set it up within these pages at the end of chapter 4. So there is like that sense, but like at the same time, he wants to really drive home that we are inextricably caught up in this, and he says on the last page that any sort of authentic self-actualizing, he doesn't use those words, but any sort of authentic being oneself, it does not rest on an exceptional condition of the subject, he says. A condition that has been detached from the they. You can't detach from the they. There is no becoming the Übermensch here. There is only existential modifications.
Yes.
You know, so those existential modifications are resting upon the basis, the firm basis, the ground of the they. And remember, like, when we're using the tool and it invokes the referential totality of assignments or references that make it, or they give it any sort of significance or give you the ability to project forward and do anything with these things, that they work best when they're operating inconspicuously, right? And that's a positive thing overall. I mean, at least that's what I get from it, though, is that's a positive thing overall. It is a good thing if, and I would argue this as a sort of socialist, that like, there are things that I think that we, as part of our social contract, could just agree to have, you know, oh, let's make a job out of that and have that taken care of, where I don't have to worry about taking the trash out, and I don't have to worry about, you know, repaving the road, and I don't have to worry about arguing with private contractors about, you know, how much that road's going to cost or whatever. Let's just like have some of these burdens, like, and that can be a positive thing because we've got more important stuff to be focusing on. Right. And that, I mean, in the same way, it's like, I don't need to know how my car's engine works. I need to, you know, anybody who's specializing in any area needs some extra time and energy to be able to go in those areas. And that means that you've got to have people down the line all specializing in other areas to take some of that, to do some of that disburdening, to free you up into your own pursuits. So, I mean, but the thing is like the reality he's getting at here is the reality upon which this political battle manifests. And the interesting part is that when we try to think of like how Nazism fits into this, I needed to add that I did read somewhere that when Marcuse wrote him a letter asking him, you know, like, you know, Marcuse is a Jew, you know, he's part of the Frankfurt School, does critical theory, highly influenced by Heidegger, you know, he studied under Heidegger. He sends Heidegger a letter being like, how could you have, you know, been a Nazi, you know, and this is after World War II. And his reply was basically, it was either that or communism. I mean, that was his response. He just wasn't happy with either choice, and he wasn't really himself. And this is something Badiou and I forget the other professor, Badiou and another professor wrote a book about Heidegger, and like they spent a couple chapters on the idea of like, was he even political in any way about his being? And like, on the one hand, the other professor is like arguing, no, a philosopher properly cannot be political. And then Badiou is trying to argue, no, but everything's political. He just rejected that fact and therefore fell into this thing.
And then Hannah Arendt kind of brought the same thing to him, and that's, I think, the fact that Heidegger fell into Nazism, and falling in is a really good way of putting it. It was the they-ness of the time that he went along with, because it was easier. He got to keep his professorship, and you know.
I just wanted to point out before we left this example that the welfare, maybe not the state, but welfare is literally the translation that he uses about this care situation. He really means like social structures of care, like that's what's appropriate to this word that he's using, solicitude. And so I think we actually kind of are right on the money with this conversation.
Probably, I mean, it's included in it for sure, because Fürsorge is.
I think he could have been talking to you about religious organizations. Like, I think you're totally right, but I think also other. I don't know. I guess I don't know what. Sorry.
The one thing I also really wanted to make sure to bring up, though, because the beginning of this conversation was Jacob talking about the resonances of all of this with the state, and he talked about the nation. I just wanted to make sure to point out that a nation is a totality of individuals, a sum total, and that although the nation, sure enough, will have be kind of predicated on the they is not the sum total of the individuals of some group. The they is also as one does, right? Das Mann is the man or a man. Like, the idea is like, when I think, well, that's just what one does. And this gets exactly at like the idea of normativity itself. Whenever, I mean, Sammy and I have had so many conversations where we talk about, there's always like this abstract, American family that we all have some idea about. We seem to know how they live.
And hamburgers and grilled steaks and potatoes and
the dad,
has a flag in the yard.
He barbecues, and the mom, she cooks. And
are you saying that didn't happen today?
No, that happens. It does happen. But what were we doing? We were doing as one does, right? We're doing as one does. So it's not just, it's they and one and also no one. Because at the end of the day, we're all acting out or putting to action or performing these normative, very vague, very abstract notions of like whatever it is people do. And you're justified in the extent that other people do it, like to some degree. I mean, you might think that, the average person is not that intelligent, but hey, as long as I'm doing what the average person does, I can't really be in trouble, right? Like, no one's going to hold it against me if I'm doing it reasonably close to the way people do things. And then that's really like and someone had brought up responsibility. And I always thought that the most important couple of sentences here are in the end, about, there's two. And the one I was getting to is, he says at the bottom of 165, second to last paragraph, bottom of that, he says, it was always the they who did it, and yet it can be said that it has been no one. It's this whole idea that like within institutions and within rather big groups, like there's all this sloughing of responsibility. It's always like, try to deal with Verizon and try to find who's responsible at Verizon. Nobody's responsible at the end of the day, right? At the end, maybe some desk lackeys or management person is going to get suspended for a while, but no one's actually responsible for anything. And good luck trying to pin it down, because everyone, the CEO is serving the interests of the shareholders and.
Right, or because it seems to me like there can be multiple versions of the they or existences of the they, because you run into like those obstacles. It seems like like if you're having dinner with somebody, like going on a first date, or no, how about a big group? You're having dinner with a big group of people. I instinctively don't eat generally until everyone has food, right? And it's because that's what one does.
Totally.
Simply, there are other people who very much so just the food's on the plate, you eat it, right? So it's kind of a different idea of what one does, but like, which is why it isn't necessarily like just all individuals,
right,
but like the group just as a general concept.
Well, when Heidegger is talking about it, he doesn't. Okay, so on page 64, he says these others more are not definite others, but he also has said that it's that these others are usually the others closest to you. So sometimes the they can be your family, but you don't even realize it. So what one does is like determined by your community and your family and your culture, and but you usually just say they because that can take the responsibility. It's just like it's like so people might ask you, well, why do you do that at dinner? And you might not have known it's something weird your family does. But you're like, oh, it's what one does because you're so habituated to it. You don't realize it's not what one does, and then your concept of what one does can. But it's basically morality. It's basically social morality in a sense, and we have a Black Notebooks conversation going on the side.
I can't.
Hold on a second. It goes up.
Distantality.
Oh wait.
Distantatiality.
The Black Notebooks. Oh, he was just saying he doesn't know if it's true that
I'm not a fan of Heidegger apologetics because he was a Nazi. He never apologized for being a Nazi. And so I think it's very important to look at his book through the lens that he was a Nazi. That's not to say I don't think that Heidegger isn't useful. I think Heidegger is immensely useful. And I think that his work is very important to read. I think the same thing about Carl Schmitt. But I don't like this idea that we just we push the Nazism to the side and pretend that Heidegger wasn't a Nazi. And we pretend that his thought wasn't influential on his Nazism because his very ideas about the they being thrown into the world and being thrown into this world of this certain group of people is very influential on him and his Nazism. I think it's really important to be aware of that and think critically about that when reading Heidegger.
So I would have a slightly different perspective. I don't disagree with what you're saying about the importance of recognizing the political context, but I also think generally when I approach a text, the author is dead, right? They're dead. Their opinion about the text or what they were thinking or what they were, meant to do or intended to do, that's just, I mean, for example, the fact that Hemingway was a misogynist does not necessarily mean I default to feminist lens every time I read a book by Hemingway, right? Like Hemingway's dead, right? His personal opinions, his politics, they don't necessarily influence how I read the text or how I evaluate it in a vacuum.
I mean, at the same time, it's always, I think, important to remember that it's a really interesting question how to read the text because, like, so for instance, my favorite book still kind of is, I think it still is one of my favorites at least, East of Eden by John Steinbeck. The second time I really deeply read it, because I read it a couple times before that, it was after I'd been introduced to, a lot of more critical theory and philosophy, and all of a sudden I was like, this is actually like, this is so number one male centric, and there's just all these little things you start to notice, but you don't want to let it distract you from the narrative of the book and how beautiful the book is, but it's just something that you have to keep in mind. So in a sense, I think Jacob's point is fair that we do have to keep in mind, we are obligated in some sense to keep in mind or to let it come up when it does, that yes, Heidegger in the Black Notebooks were pretty damning.
I don't think that's true.
I mean, well, I don't know if you've read them. I haven't either, but like that's what they say.
Right. No, that's right.
But I think it's okay to let it come up, but I don't think it's okay to let it consume and destroy what is valuable in the book and appreciating his thoughts.
Jacob's agreeing with you on that.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if the book had been published anonymously, would it change how you read it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why?
That's a fundamental question people have been thinking about in terms of how we read text.
Because we always go towards the
Like,
text on the basis of already having been with the author.
Whoa,
Too many
whoa,
people
no,
talking
no.
at once.
Hold on, I
Let
think
Jacob go.
Jacob's got a thing.
Because we always go towards the text having always already been with the author.
He wrote the book in 27. He joined the party in 33.
Right. No, but Jacob's saying though that without this thought, he couldn't have been Nazi. I would just respond that there were millions of people who, without any analysis whatsoever, were also Nazis, and a lot of them begrudgingly so. And Heidegger was undoubtedly a begrudging Nazi, and that's.
I don't know if we can say that definitively. And second,
Well,
I'm not saying that his thought necessarily leads to Nazism, but I think that we need to be critical of his thought where it is possible to lead to an end similar to Nazism. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. That's just something that cropped up to me as I was reading this particular section of the book. I was thinking, oh, this does flow his eventual Nazism. I don't think it essentially goes that way. I don't think it necessarily flows that way. But I do think it's interesting to look at how his thought could make him susceptible to that mode of being.
So that we could be wary of that mode of being.
Right, and I think that mid 168, 167, he agrees with you, right? Because he says Dasein is for the sake of the they in an everyday manner, and the they itself articulates the referential context of significance, right? The world of meaning we have is like articulated by the they, and there's going to be this sense within which it's like, well, he doesn't do this in this book, but it's a worthy. It's worth bringing up. Here's a justification for Nazism using Heideggerianese, and I'm not saying he argues for that, and I do know that I can list off like 5 Heidegger scholars who would not take this seriously, but here's a rendering. If you think about nations as people, then you think about the global situation. That changes things. And then you think about, okay, so if the metaphor is that Germany is Dasein, just like France or Japan is, then then there's a certain sense in which we are thrown into this situation, into a historical context. We are a historical player. We have a role to play. We can either kind of go with the flow, or we can take the reins and do what needs to be done. Let's roll our sleeves up and do the thing that no one else wants to do, because there is this problem, Jews, capitalism, technology, what have you, that needs to be fixed, and no one wants to do it, but we better do it, or otherwise we're going to be swept away by communism. Let's go. And so that's totally a Nazi justification. I don't know that he says that, and I know that it's highly contested, the stuff that he does say in the Black Notebooks. But you're right, it's totally here.
Yeah, and I don't want to dismantle the text, because I think that the text is super useful and it's super important to read. And I think he's making a lot of very good descriptive claims, some of which I disagree with. And I don't think it necessarily leads to Nazism, because we can look at like Foucault and see at least until late Foucault, he's coming in a completely opposite direction, right? Like, not that Foucault is the biggest leftist in the world, but he's definitely coming at very similar material in a very different way than Heidegger.
Totally, yeah, and I do think that at the end of the day, though, like this existential framework allows for all sorts of possibilities and all sorts of directions, and that there are Heideggerians that are fascists as much as there are Heideggerians who are communists, whether it be Sartre as the communist, or neo-Marxists like Marcuse or Habermas, but they were Heideggerians. And well, Foucault is a Heideggerian too. He said so at his deathbed.
I just wanted to bring up the death of the author comment that Jacob made, and
well, I think that was Andy that sent the death of the author book.
Okay, I thought I got that wrong. That I have taken a stance among my peers that is controversial through the influence of psychoanalysis, which is that I'm prepared to do psychobiography at any time, given any resource available at any. I'm going to grab at it, and that doesn't discount ideas. It actually just contextualizes them. So, so that's one thing. So, it's if philosophers are accountable to their ideas, they are also accountable to their lives. And that means those aspects of those lives that formed them beyond their consent and control, in addition to the choices that they made. So go origins, go author, go psychobiography. And then number 2, about Nazism, it's scary because it's close. So I don't want to, because we use Nazism as a limit case, as a kind of extreme manifestation of forces that seem to be beyond human, other than human, supra-human or something like that. It just bears this extra weight, but in a way, that's what keeps us from doing really careful analysis about our own, modes of genocidal, fascist authoritarianism, etc., groupthink. And so I don't mean to diminish the power of the word or the term, but to humanize Nazis is also super duper important, because we could be them at any minute, and in fact already are in some cases.
I think Lydia's point is okay. So it's something I've thought about a lot too, and I just want to say, the trauma of the Holocaust impacted the whole entire world, and I like to do cultural psychoanalysis sort of stuff too. So, so I sympathize, Lydia, but the writing of the critical theorists like Adorno and Horkheimer were so dark, and they were writing after World War II, and it was just like a huge psychological, mass psychological impact, or just if we're going to speak in Heideggerese, it changed the situation, and it's what changed everybody's mood, because they were in this. Everybody who was impacted by that in any way, and it was pretty much the whole world. It was a world war.
Everyone
was impacted by it. So that's part of the reason why we demonize. And I'm not saying that they're not to be demonized. It was really horrible, right? But the reason that we need Nazis to be the ultimate enemy and the ultimate demon is because it was such a traumatic thing to think that human beings could do this in such a precise, clean, technological manner, that human beings, which we are DAs, we're all Dasein, could do this. So in a sense, Lydia, I am just agreeing with you to say that we need to be careful not to just make it this guy was influenced by the devil, so we want to be careful with this text, we could get infected with demons. It's not like that. We have to face some of these.
And I don't think anyone is. I just wanted to throw in also that, in Hannah Arendt's the Origins of Totalitarianism, she, and as a Heideggerian, she's arguing that the kind of evil. No, I'm sorry. It was Eichmann in Jerusalem. Is that it?
Yeah.
She talks about the banality of evil, and she caught a lot of flack for this, basically taking Eichmann, who's one of the worst offenders of Nazism, and saying the guy was normal. The guy was relatively normal. This is the banality of evil. What's closest to us is that we don't realize how evil we can be, or how we can just turn off certain switches in our head or whatever. But the idea is when you just go with the they paths that are laid before you, then normality can be evil. And I mean, that's really what her point was. It's this guy's not some special exceptional case. And this is really just adding to what you both already said. No one This is
Right.
not to argue with anybody, but like, yeah, it proves the point that you don't have to be some like psychopath. You know, you become a psychopath by being normative sometimes.
Right.
And that it's like a slow process before you're there, and then
Wearing down on your will.
Nothing.
Isn't that what we were talking about with Dante's Inferno the other night? Was Dante was the first writer to really express, you think your mind is evil? I'm going to put it down in writing. 9 levels of hell. You think hell, you know hell? We're going to dive down 9 levels.
But also, most of the characters in Dante's Inferno were humanized.
Right.
I mean, you feel sorry for them,
Right.
like they did something shitty, but they're like, you
But
know.
he could imagine that horror.
Well, you could
And
imagine their psychological
so
state
did-
in
so
a
did-
sense.
yeah,
So did Eichmann. Eichmann just had a good imagination.
No, he actually had zero imagination.
Well, okay.
he was not thinking is the problem. That's at least that's what Arendt says. But so we've got 22 minutes roughly. There is some real difficult stuff in chapter 5. I think we've got to get to some of that, and I know we did already with the potentiality and possibility stuff, but I guess it would probably be best for people to just like, if you have like two things. One is that just to restate, Lee Braver said that there is stuff in here that's kind of tangential and like a corollary or not too essential to what he's ultimately doing here. There's some of him just thinking out loud. So let's and there's parts here that are just pretty difficult, but then there's also like stuff that's absolutely like essential that we touch on and make sure that everyone's comfortable with certain ideas, such as Dasein being disclosedness or understanding being necessarily projecting, these sorts of things. But let's just see, like, first, does anyone have any like kind of burning questions about chapter 5 up to 188? It's a really cool psychoanalysis tie-in, I thought.
What page?
Ooh, excuse me.
Wow.
Because I thought there was a lot of those too. Cool psychoanalysis.
Can we spend just a little bit of time differentiating between projecting and possibilities? Like how those two are different. I get that there is a difference. And I think we talked about possibilities earlier, so maybe just hone in on projection a little more. I'm not quite.
There's a page where he basically first coins it. Does anybody have that handy?
Nope.
Usually it's where it's in italics, if you can find that.
It's probably the 185 instance right there at the top.
Which we call projection. That sounds right.
Structure, yeah. Why does the understanding, whatever may be the essential dimensions of that which can be disclosed in it, always press forward into possibilities? It is because the understanding has in itself the existential structure, which we call projection. Now, that was the end of 184, the beginning of 185. So what is the relation between projection and possibilities?
So earlier today, I stumbled across this that I think helps understand it, is the job test for designers at Google is how would you design a 1,000-floor elevator interface? And you go, oh, first you use a presumption reflex, which is the same thing as projecting. You're assuming that it's for me. It may not ever be for you. It may be an elevator interface for something entirely different, okay? And then you're asking, do you know the purpose? No. What's the purpose of this particular elevator in this 1,000-floor interface? Maybe it's freight. Maybe it's trash.
So you have to sign one.
Maybe it's people. Okay. So these are all projections that we take out of our they-ness and the environment around us, and we project on situations before we even understand what they are. You did it too. You assumed it was a 1,000-floor elevator. It must be for people. What if it's not? What if it's for cars? Okay. So I'm going to move cars around in an entirely different status than I will people or trash. Always goes to the first floor, right? The basement. So that's my idea of what projection is you're projecting onto situations a bunch of junk that you don't even know. And you immediately default to it. Oh, it's got to be about me. Selfish, selfish, selfish.
Right, and this is how the they outstrips our own possibilities in a certain sense by laying out definite fixed routes or ways of going about things, because I mean those are universals. You know, they can be done by anyone. Whereas like you coming from a particular situation, you've got stuff that maybe, I mean, you might want to do it different, but if you just kind of go with what's ready to hand there, your possibilities will become their possibilities. And I like to always use this example from when I taught English literacy in Belize for a week a couple summers ago through a class. All the students in like this 5th grade class, when they were writing these letters to themselves, to their future selves, one of the prompts on the whiteboard was, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so 25 students, 3 answers. And, you know, it's a small rural town, you know, at Chan Chen Elementary School. Well, and in a small rural town, there's basically 4 options that these kids have grown up seeing. Sugarcane worker, which is what almost all their dads are doing, you know, or stay-at-home mom, which is almost what all their moms are doing. So that's the 2 options that nobody wanted in their in their letters. And then everyone's got pilot, doctor, or teacher, which is like the only 3 things they've seen.
Awesome, yeah. Yeah,
but
right.
that's all they, you know, that's literally the extent
That's
of
all
their
they've ever
possibilities.
That's what they see.
So their letters to themselves and their letters about themselves are, how would I fit in? Why do I want to be a pilot for this and this reason? But like they've got such limited possibilities there that, you know, maybe for some kids they're really having to try to fit themselves into one of those boxes, I guess.
Sure.
And projecting is not just this projecting the they's possibilities or projecting your own possibilities, but it's just think of it as there's all these different ways things could be. And so if let's just say that you were like, well, my 3 options to get out of this town, and I do want to get out of this town because I want money. You know, my 3 options are, you know, pilot, doctor, teacher. If I end up being a sugarcane worker for the rest of my life, that's an existential positive characteristic of my being from then on. The fact that I'm not that thing that I was trying to be because I didn't get into college. So, what page is it? Heidegger does say it though, that like, if you just look at the person as who they are there in front of you right now, or if you were to find out what are you? You know, and the person says, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this other thing, I'm this, I'm that. They can list down all these positive characteristics of what they have done and are doing, but you really have no idea of like the things that they didn't do or weren't able to do and how that's shaping them as well.
But isn't that all still within the realm of possibilities rather than projections?
Projections, so
Is projections like a Dasein projecting itself into the world in the sense of like how it can interact with the world? I guess going back to the elevator. No.
I think that's not, I think we're not using, I think he's not using his notion of projecting as psychological projecting like we would in a kind of pop psych way. I think he's using it as the opposite. It's like being thrown. That means there's something about it which is always like there. And by being there, it's already participating in possibilities. Like, so projecting and possibilities go together, not opposed.
Yeah.
So when you
You broke out.
Oh, Andy rejoined it. Sorry. Okay.
I was just asking. Am I correct or no?
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, so I wanted to point out a footnote on page 85.
I was trying to make sense
with
of that.
footnotes, because the basic, so entwerf, which is projection, throwing something off or away from one, but in ordinary German usage, this word takes on the sense of designing or sketching some project which is to be carried through. They may also be used in the more special sense of projection. Okay, wait. So project and projection, because they go together in English, are good translations. But so throwing. So when we talk about a imagine projectile rocket or projectile vomit. It means throwing it away, like it's being sent out, but at the same time, it's like you're throwing out a project before you. You're not projecting as in like, I don't know. It's not in that pop psychology sense, but like it's like you're like rolling out a blueprint in front of you, like onto the world, and you're gonna try to like make that happen, right? It's sort of a like looking into the future, or like where you are and being like, all of these things, I'm gonna try to do that, or this all could happen, you know?
You're still projecting that the elevator is for you. Okay, it's not for you. We don't know that. Okay, that hasn't been defined for us yet.
Well, yeah,
and that's the place where you have to free yourself from that projection. That's the thing that he's trying to understand here, is that if you don't understand what projection is, then you can't free yourself from it and think outside of the box of projecting yourself.
So, well, if the they has given you X, Y, and Z in your referential totality, you've got those projections, and until you understand how that works, how those are thrown out before you, then you can't come to terms with things on your own.
It's also not prescriptive in the sense that, like, we're even going to get into using the language in the next chapter, like conscience here, you know, and that's like, we feel a sort of, we've betrayed ourselves if we don't do the thing that we feel we should be doing, like, oh, I'm not being true to myself, right? There's like this phenomenology of the kind of conscience that realizes I'm not being true to myself right now. But at the same time, just because that exists doesn't mean that there is then you should always be trying to break out of the they's ways. Well, we should probably be critical of it. I guess I'm throwing that in there, but like, he's not going to say it. He's trying to be neutral about that.
Mm-hmm.
The translation words, and maybe even the original words, aren't that. I mean, they come with some moral connotations though, like falling. But
yeah, it literally, he even uses, instead of just fallen, which is the German word, he uses verfallen, which has connotations of decaying. But he still insists that it's neutral, so it's really interesting.
Well, I mean, and it's just dialect is a version of like the kind of theyness that's closest to us. You know, you don't really realize that you have a dialect until an accent. I mean, until you're around other people, you know, who are speaking a different one, and then you're like, wow, that must mean that I have one. You know, and there's all sorts of ways that this plays out where it's like you couldn't moralize that. You know, like it's not, and you don't necessarily want to change it. There's probably no good reason for me to start speaking with an accent just because the they kind of has this North American accent.
It's appealing to me.
Invent your own accent.
Well, and kids do that when they realize they have one. I mean, I used to try to make up my own languages once I realized I didn't make any of the language I was using.
Oh, they've known it for years in English-speaking societies. The English accent or the Australian accent garners more attention to the human ear than the other ones.
Huh.
To the human ear.
To the human ear. I wonder what social science study said that, yeah, right. And what humans they use.
Okay, well, maybe I ad-libbed a little bit with the human ear part, but to the English-speaking ear, It's a preference.
Sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, Australian or English.
And you know that
United Kingdom. Well, I should rephrase that. United Kingdom.
Well, if language is the house of being, then you're going to feel most at home hearing the language that you're most habituated to, that because what you're habituated to would be your habitat, your home, your habitus. And having spent some time out of the country in like a place where I didn't really speak the language at all, like you feel homeless. You feel like completely alienated when you're just like surrounded. You just don't know.
I didn't like it.
Yeah. So I mean, if that's what the social science, study was.
No, it was more explicitly
Catching on.
stating that 2 accents are the best.
And you know where those accents came from? The reason why Americans don't have the stereotypical high British accent from a certain area of the UK, there are lots of different accents actually there, is because it was basically there was some royalty that had a strange way of speaking. It was almost like a lisp, and people around them started imitating this person to make them feel better, and it became fashionable, and then everyone started affecting it, and then it got into like television and movies, and basically the English accent that we think of was sort of like not quite invented, but it was affected. And so the Queen's English is literally the Queen's English. It's not some original. So I don't know, that social science study would be suspect. But
there's a historical aspect to that too, with the Habsburg family line.
Yeah.
I mean, they were inbred and they didn't speak very well.
Yeah.
Hey, so 6 minutes left. I see that Lydia said something about trajectory. I don't know if that was a point to bring up, or if anybody on the video end has anything they want to throw in before this is over. Please always feel free to like interject, because like
we have the power of like interacting with each other's materiality.
Yeah. So I think we all get self-conscious about hogging airtime, but my word for project, Lydia says, is trajectory. Totally, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Cool. Sorry I hogged up the last half hour.
No, we did.
It turns out that no definition for Heidegger is easy when you're really trying to get at the meaning of words. Unfortunately.
Or we just get lit up about life,
Well, right. Then
commentary, because you can't do phenomenology without bringing to bear like life commentary. So that's just too much fun.
Yeah. So how does losing a chicken have to deal with all of this today?
Oh man.
No, Ty.
Well, then we have to start talking about moods.
Okay, so we're talking about permaculture,
We lost the
right?
chicken.
Yes.
Permaculture and moods.
Bringing up the what happens here on the farm aspect. Yes, we lost a chicken this morning. We had 6 chicks. 1 died just from natural causes, or just chicks often die when they're growing up. And then so I brought this Banty chicken, the kind with the feathered feet, in to join the little nest. And then anyway, this morning the dog was off the leash, and one of the chickens had gotten outside of the fence, and the dog just swoops, and it was gone before it knew.
Wait, did you say it was the Banty that got eaten?
No, the Banty did not get eaten.
No, it was
thankfully.
one of the black and white ones.
I feel like there's some like value placed on this Banty
There
based on
is.
things.
There's definitely value placed on
It's
the
based
Banty.
on the fact that there's one Banty.
I drove it 8 hours
And
to
it's
get
got
here.
feathers on its
And it's
feet.
from
It's cool.
McCarricker Family Farm.
Yeah.
It's a hobbit chicken.
Right.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. Banty is great.
It's the
But
proto.
so that's life in a nutshell.
I'm really upset about it. I know that's not, an adequate farm response, but I'm upset that the dog ate the chicken.
No,
Me
I'm told
too.
we're all upset.
The dog's going to get penalized for several days.
You know that
That's just it. The dog's going to pay for it.
You know that term, he's out in the dog shed, or he's out in the doghouse, like.
Yeah, doghouse.
Well, it's true, like
Yeah.
in the most literal
No,
form.
he's persona non grata.
No, yeah.
No,
Ty went and
no.
bought a new. Ty does not like using electric collars on animals, but he's officially gone and gotten like some.
Henry has behavioral problems.
Henry has
as they
behavioral
say.
problems. As do apparently
As do all
labs like to eat
Labradors.
chickens.
I have a Labrador. I got him because he was eating chickens.
They just swoop in and eat them up. I mean, it's like he had the frisbee in his mouth one minute and a chicken in his mouth the next.
They're bred for birds.
What the hell?
Well, they're made for duck hunting.
Yeah, they're bred for birds, so you can't really.
You can't really fault him for it. It was like what he was supposed to do.
It's like when you get mad at pugs for sounding like a strangled chicken.
Right. Don't get mad at the pug. Get mad at yourself for buying it.
So I guess we've talked a lot about possibilities in reference to the first couple of sections here in chapter 5. I wanted to just, I think one of the biggest things left hanging here is moods. We haven't talked a lot about moods, and maybe it's not too important to do so just yet, but is everyone comfortable with what he's saying about moods? Does it make sense? Do we have questions about moods?
It actually made a lot
Can
of
we
sense.
talk about the next time after I have an opportunity to finish the moods reading? Because I'm sorry, I'm always this person.
Well, I
read ahead. I read ahead out of the folded page.
Likely, okay.
so
Just because it's the same chapter we're still working in.
But
it will come up more, and really like mood and understanding are like inextricable, right? And I'll just use this one concrete example. If your mood is depressed, then the possibilities being projected for you are very different, and they're probably for the most part deficient, right? There's just not a lot of possibilities glimmering in your projections.
That's like the definition of depressed.
Right, exactly. Like
There's a possibility.
anxiety is like any of the possibilities that you see aren't looking good, and they're all imminent, right? So we just see that like moods shape that projection, and that this is our way of being that precedes any sort of scientific or ontical analysis, and he's trying to say that like understanding and moods and interpretation are all going to be this thing from which everything else is derivative.
Well, I think that the last word there, the interpretation, is the most seminal part of it. Is yes, there's understanding, yes, there's moods, but how do you interpret those? Okay, that's the biggest, you know me, okay? I like the iterative process. That's the iterative process. How do you interpret? You go out on a limb, you test an idea, you come back in, you look at it again from another point of view, and you go out on a limb again and you test a different idea. And after you've tested enough ideas, you come to a conclusion, whether it's right or wrong, but you come to a conclusion that leads you to a course of action. And I think that's what interpretation is.
I think that what you're talking about is derivative of what he'll be saying is interpretation, because what you're talking about, that's part of the functioning of interpretation, right? That's a way that it manifests. It's also a more conscious way. It's a more aware way. Mm-hmm. It sounds a lot like the scientific process. Whereas that stuff's also going on in the background all the time. There's entire parts of our brain dedicated to doing all of that constantly without our awareness. So just as long as you remember that other aspect of it as well, that's the background noise, and that other people are doing it and learning, and then you're inheriting that stuff through osmosis, basically, without realizing it. Then as long as you keep that in mind, then totally, absolutely.
Yeah. I only say that because everything is so forced towards a linear process. I don't see a linear process anywhere.
Hey, I wanted to go back to Jacob's comment about possibility and potential and the anti-Sartrean nature of that. And I feel like that's impacting, or not that comment, but what Jacob is talking about is impacting my understanding of mood, like in this idea of essential. So there is a piece of this that seems to be like essentially Dasein, like that seems almost anti-existential. And so I just wanted to like maybe tie that in. I'm looking at page 182, I think.
I'm gonna head out.
Okay.
By the way.
Later, Jacob.
Yeah, I gotta go too. Thanks for everything, guys.
Yeah. Take care, Andy.
See your blue body next week.
I'm really tired too. So we don't have to do that, but I just feel like there's a weird essential state of mind. Fear as part of an essential state of mind is like different from being in the world and experiencing things, and therefore having a nature.
I'm actually really happy you brought this up because it reminds me of something I've been wanting to bring up, and I don't know if this will kind of, well, I think it will, because you're a bit of a fan of Plato, if I'm not mistaken, and Lee Braver in the introduction to Heidegger Thinking on Being, talking about how he does this over and over. Heidegger does this thing over and over again, where he says, for instance, like, well, we must have some kind of an understanding of being because we're asking the question, right? And this is a very Platonic notion. The idea that truth is something that seems familiar to us, right? Because there's that basic dilemma. How do you know the truth? If you don't have a preconception of the truth, then how are you going to know what's true when you actually do see it? And if you already know it, then what's the point of learning anything? And then Plato's answer is, well, you knew the truth, but you forgot it. And so the learning process is this remembrance. So when someone shows you something that's true, you're like, oh, that makes sense. And so and basically Heidegger does that. He's kind of playing off of that over and over again throughout all of these chapters, where he will set up something like concern. He gives 3 examples of ways that we think about concern, but then he's like, but the possibilities of any of those ways of concern is itself an existential. What that kind of means is that, like, there's the existential basis allows for those different ways of that unfolding. And the same thing here with fear. He says that you can't be afraid of something without fearfulness as a sort of like structure of your being already.
I didn't see it as fearfulness being a structure of your being. I saw it as more.
He boils it down to fearfulness as an existential.
That was the part I didn't get to, but it seemed to me that he was just saying something has to matter to you before you can be threatened, even if it's just staying alive.
Yes, but you also couldn't make sense of that thing as fearful or as scary without, like,
just fundamentally being
scared.
fearful.
You have a fundamental attunement to fear as an ever-pending possibility that you can have revealed or awakened in a moment by a bear charging you, but it's always present.
I wish I would have had that analysis as a school child, being called a scaredy cat.
You're all scaredy cats.
We all are. It's part of who we are. Go fuck off.
Your Dasein cares. Sorry. Right? It's kind of like, and we'll also just, concern, which concern and solicitude are both rooted in the existential care, which we're going to be getting to here. And care is like the ability to give a shit or the ability to not give a shit. Either way, care is like the grounding basis of all of those different ways of being. And the flip side of care is going to be angst, right? And angst is they always say angst.
Oh, okay.
They say angst just to kind of like push the German. It's because it's not just angst how we talk about teenagers being angsty. This is like angst, as in like this, highly developed or sophisticated like German like word. This is a word that was Kierkegaard's for an entire career before Heidegger started using it. And so it's the being towards death, or this fleeing in the face of death, this having our ever pending possibility of no more possibilities, this hovering what if of our impending doom, always driving our fleeing.
Hence Brian doesn't climb on rocks when they go hiking together.
The being not climbing on rocks is the being that's taking a resolute stand on its utmost possibility.
I'm going to take that rock climbing, imagining them being slippery, actually, as like my like visual cue to X out. Existentiality.
Rock on.
Super tired. I'm super tired.
You're quite great, though.
Yeah, it's late over there. So.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yeah, you're up late.
I love that. Thank you guys. Chicken.
Lydia.
Chicken.
Thank you. Bye.
It's hot.